Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Palace Walk by Naguib Mahfouz, translated by William Maynard Hutchins and Olive E. Kenny, narrated by Neil Shah. 1. She woke at midnight. She always woke up then, without having to rely on an alarm clock. A wish that had taken root in her awoke her with great accuracy. For a few moments she was not sure she was awake. Images from her dreams and perceptions mixed together in her mind. She was troubled by anxiety before opening her eyes, afraid sleep had deceived her. Shaking her head gently, she gazed at the total darkness of the room. There was no clue by which to judge the time. The street noise outside her room would continue until dawn. She could hear the babble of voices from the coffee-houses and bars, whether it was early evening, midnight, or just before daybreak. She had no evidence to rely on except her intuition, like a conscious clock hand, and the silence encompassing the house, which revealed that her husband had not yet rapped at the door, and that the tip of his stick had not yet struck against the steps of the staircase. Habit woke her at this hour. It was an old habit she had developed when young, and it had stayed with her as she matured. She had learned it along with the other rules of married life. She woke up at midnight to await her husband's return from his evening's entertainment. Then she would serve him until he went to sleep. She sat up in bed resolutely to overcome the temptation posed by sleep. After invoking the name of God, she slipped out from under the covers and onto the floor. Groping her way to the door, she guided herself by the bedpost and a panel of the window. As she opened the door, faint rays of light filtered in from a lamp set on a bracketed shelf in the sitting room. She went to fetch it, and the glass projected onto the ceiling a trembling circle of pale light, hemmed in by darkness. She placed the lamp on the table by the sofa. The light shone throughout the room, revealing the large, square floor, high walls, and ceiling with parallel beams. The quality of the furnishings was evident. The Shiraz carpet, large brass bed, massive armoire, and long sofa draped with a small rug in a patchwork design of different motifs and colors. The woman headed for the mirror to look at herself. She noted that her brown scarf was wrinkled and pushed back. Strands of chestnut hair had crept down over her forehead. Grasping the knot with her fingers, she untied it. She smoothed the scarf around her hair and retied the two ends slowly and carefully. She wiped the sides of her face with her hands, as though trying to erase any last vestiges of sleep. In her 40s, and of medium build, she looked slender, although her body's soft skin was filled out to its narrow limits in a charmingly harmonious and symmetrical way. Her face was oblong, with a high forehead and delicate features. She had beautiful small eyes, with a sweet, dreamy look. Her nose was petite and thin, flaring out a little at the nostrils. Beneath her tender lips, a tapered chin descended. The pure, fair skin of her cheek revealed a beauty spot of intensely pure black. She seemed to be in a hurry as she wrapped her veil about her and headed for the door to the balcony. Opening it, she entered the closed cage formed by the wooden latticework and stood there, turning her face right and left while she peeked out through the tiny round openings of the latticework panels that protected her from being seen from the street. The balcony overlooked the ancient building housing a cistern downstairs and a school upstairs, which was situated in the middle of Palace Walk, or Bain el Qasrain. Two roads met there, in Nahassin, or Coppersmith Street, going south, and Palace Walk, which went north. To her left, the street appeared narrow and twisting. It was enveloped in a gloom that was thicker overhead, where the windows of the sleeping houses looked down, and less noticeable at street level, because of the light coming from the handcarts and from the vapor lamps of the coffee-houses and the shops that stayed open until dawn. To her right, the street was engulfed in darkness. There were no coffee-houses in that direction, only large stores, which closed early. There was nothing to attract the eye except the minarets of the ancient seminaries of Kalaun and Barkuk, which loomed up like ghostly giants, enjoying a night out by the light of the gleaming stars. It was a view that had grown on her over a quarter of a century. She never tired of it. Perhaps boredom was an irrelevant concept for a life as monotonous as hers. The view had been a companion for her in her solitude, and a friend in her loneliness during a long period when she was deprived of friends and companions before her children were born, when for most of the day and night she had been the sole occupant of this large house, with its 2 stories of spacious rooms with high ceilings, its dusty courtyard, and deep well. She had married before she turned 14, and had soon found herself the mistress of the big house, following the deaths of her husband's parents. An elderly woman had assisted her in looking after it, but deserted her at dusk to sleep in the oven-room in the courtyard, leaving her alone in a nocturnal world teeming with spirits and ghosts. She would doze for an hour and lie awake the next, until her redoubtable husband returned from a long night out. To set her mind at rest, she had gotten into the habit of going from room to room, accompanied by her maid, who held the lamp for her, while she cast searching, frightened glances through the rooms, one after the other. She began with the first floor, and continued with the upper story, reciting the Quran surahs she knew, in order to ward off demons. She would conclude with her room, lock the door, and get into bed. But her recitations would continue until she fell asleep. She had been terrified of the night when she first lived in this house. She knew far more about the world of the jinn than that of mankind, and remained convinced that she was not alone in the big house. There were demons who could not be lured away from these spacious, empty old rooms for long. Perhaps they had sought refuge there before she herself had been brought to the house, even before she saw the light of day. She frequently heard their whispers. Time and again she was awakened by their warm breath. When she was left alone, her only defense was reciting the opening prayer of the Quran and Surah 112 from it, about the absolute supremacy of God, or rushing to the latticework screen at the window to peer anxiously through it at the lights of the carts and the coffee-houses, listening carefully for a laugh or cough to help her regain her composure. Then the children arrived, one after the other. In their early days in the world, though, they were tender sprouts, unable to dispel her fears or reassure her. On the contrary, her fears were multiplied by her troubled soul's concern for them, and her anxiety that they might be harmed. She would hold them tight, lavish affection on them, and surround them, whether awake or asleep, with a protective shield of Quran surahs, amulets, charms, and incantations. True peace of mind she would not achieve until her husband returned from his evening's entertainment. It was not uncommon for her, while she was alone with an infant, rocking him to sleep and cuddling him, to clasp him to her breast suddenly. She would listen intently with dread and alarm, and then call out in a loud voice, as though addressing someone in the room, "Leave us alone. This isn't where you belong. We are Muslims, and believe in the one God." Then she would quickly and fervently recite the 112th surah of the Quran about the uniqueness of God. Over the course of time, as she gained more experience living with the spirits, her fears diminished a good deal. She was calm enough to jest with them without being frightened. If she happened to sense one of them prowling about, she would say in an almost intimate tone, "Have you no respect for those who worship God, the Merciful? He will protect us from you, so do us the favor of going away." But her mind was never completely at rest until her husband returned. Indeed, the mere fact of his presence in the house, whether awake or asleep was enough to make her feel secure. Then it did not matter whether the doors were open or locked, the lamp burning brightly or extinguished. It had occurred to her once, during the first year she lived with him, to venture a polite objection to his repeated nights out. His response had been to seize her by the ears and tell her peremptorily, in a loud voice, "I'm a man. I'm the one who commands and forbids. I will not accept any criticism of my behavior. All I ask of you is to obey me. Don't force me to discipline you." She learned from this, and from the other lessons that followed, to adapt to everything, even living with the jinn, in order to escape the glare of his wrathful eye. It was her duty to obey him without reservation or condition. She yielded so wholeheartedly that she even disliked blaming him privately for his nights out. She became convinced that true manliness, tyranny, and staying out till after midnight were common characteristics of a single entity. With the passage of time she grew proud of whatever he meted out, whether it pleased or saddened her. No matter what happened, she remained a loving, obedient, and docile wife. She had no regrets at all about reconciling herself to a type of security based on surrender. Whenever she thought back over her life, only goodness and happiness came to mind. Fears and sorrows seemed meaningless ghosts to her, worth nothing more than a smile of pity. Had she not lived with this husband and his shortcomings for a quarter-century, and been rewarded by children who were the apples of her eye, a home amply provided with comforts and blessings, and a happy adult life? Of course she had. Being surrounded by the jinn had been bearable, just as each evening was bearable. None of them had attempted to hurt her or the children. They had only played some harmless pranks to tease her. Praise God, the merit was all God's. He calmed her heart, and with his mercy brought order to her life. She even profoundly loved this hour of waiting up, though it interrupted a pleasant sleep and forced her to do chores that should have ceased with the end of the day. Not only had it become an integral part of her life, tied to many of her memories, but it continued to be the living symbol of her affection for her spouse, of her wholehearted dedication to making him happy, which she revealed to him night after night. For this reason she was filled with contentment as she stood in the balcony peering through the openings toward Palace Walk and Al-Khurunfush streets, and then toward Hammam el-Sultan, or the various minarets. She let her eyes wander over the houses bunched together untidily on both sides of the road, like a row of soldiers standing at ease, relaxing from harsh discipline. She smiled at the beloved view of this road, which stayed awake until the break of dawn, while the other streets, lanes, and alleys slept. It distracted her from her sleeplessness and kept her company when she was lonely, dispelling her fears. Night changed nothing save to envelop the surrounding areas with a profound silence that provided a setting in which the street sounds could ring out clearly, like the shadows at the edges of a painting that give the work depth and clarity. A laugh would resound as though bursting out in her room, and a remark made in a normal tone of voice could be heard distinctly. She could listen to a cough rattle on until it ended in a kind of moan. A waiter's voice would ring out like the call of a muezzin. "Another ball of tobacco for the pipe!" And she would merrily ask herself, "By God, are these people ordering a refill at this hour?" They reminded her of her absent husband. She would wonder, "Where do you suppose he is now? What is he doing? May he be safe and sound, whatever he does." It was suggested to her once that a man like Mr. Ahmed Abdel-Jawad, so wealthy, strong, and handsome, who stayed out night after night, must have other women in his life. At that time, her life was poisoned by jealousy, and intense sorrow overcame her. Her courage was not up to speaking to him about it, but she confided her grief to her mother, who sought as best she could to soothe her mind with fine words, telling her, "He married you after divorcing his first wife. He could have kept her too, if he'd wanted,
or taken second, third, or fourth wives. His father had many wives. Thank our Lord that you remain his only wife."
Although her mother's words did not help much then, she eventually accepted their truth and validity. Even if the rumor was accurate, perhaps that was another characteristic of manliness, like late nights and tyranny. At any rate, a single evil was better than many. It would be a mistake to allow suspicion to wreck her good life filled with happiness and comfort. Moreover, in spite of everything, perhaps the rumor was idle speculation or a lie. She discovered that jealousy was no different from the other difficulties troubling her life. To accept them was an inevitable and binding decree. Her only means of combating them was, she found, to call on patience and rely on her inner strength, the one resource in the struggle against disagreeable things. Jealousy and its motivation became something she put up with, like her husband's other troubling characteristics, or living with the jinn. She continued to watch the road and listen to the people chat until she heard a horse's hoofbeats. She turned her head toward En-Nahassin Street and saw a carriage slowly approaching, its lamp shining in the darkness. She sighed with relief and murmured, "Finally." It was the carriage of one of his friends, bringing him to the door of his house after their evening out, before continuing on as usual to Al-Khurunfush with the owner and some other friends who lived there. The carriage stopped in front of the house, and her husband's voice rang out cheerfully. "May God keep you!" She would listen lovingly and with amazement to her husband's voice when he said good night to his friends. If she had not heard him every night at about this hour, she would not have believed it. She and the children were accustomed to nothing but prudence, dignity, and gravity from him. How did he come by these joyful, jesting sounds, which flowed out so merrily and graciously? The owner of the carriage teased her husband, asking,
"Did you hear what the horse said to himself when you got out? He commented, 'It's a pity I bring a man like you home every night when all you deserve is an ass.'"
The men in the vehicle exploded with laughter. Her husband waited for them to quiet down. Then he replied, "Didn't you hear the answer? He said in that case, I'd be riding you." The men burst out laughing once more. The vehicle's owner said,
"We'll have to rest for tomorrow night."
The carriage proceeded along Palace Walk, and her husband headed for the door. She left the balcony for the bedroom. Picking up the lamp, she went to the sitting room, and then to the hall to stand at the top of the stairs. She could hear the outside door being slammed shut, and the bolt sliding into place. She imagined his tall figure crossing the courtyard as he donned awesome dignity, and shed the mirthfulness which, had she not overheard it, she would have never thought possible. Hearing the tip of his walking stick strike the steps of the stairway, she held the lamp out over the banister to light his way. 2. The man made his way toward her. She went on ahead of him, holding the lamp aloft. He followed, mumbling, "Good evening, Amina." She replied in a low voice, both polite and deferential, "Good evening, sir." When they reached the bedroom, Amina went to put the lamp on the table, while her husband hung his stick on the edge of the bedstead. He took off his fez, which he placed on the cushion at the center of the sofa, and then his wife approached to help him remove his clothes. He looked tall and broad-shouldered standing there. He had a massive body with a large, firm belly, covered smartly and comfortably by a cloak and a kaftan that showed both his good taste and his wealth. His spread of neatly combed and parted black hair, his ring with its large diamond, and his gold watch only served to emphasize his refinement and affluence. His long face was expressive, with firm skin and clean-cut features. Taken as a whole, it revealed his strong personality and good looks. He had wide blue eyes and a large, proud nose which, despite its size, was well proportioned for the expanse of his face. His lips were full, and the ends of his thick black mustache were twisted with extraordinary care. When his wife came near him, he spread his arms out. She removed his cloak and folded it carefully before placing it on the sofa. Turning back to him, she loosened the sash of his kaftan, removed it, and folded it up with similar care to lay it on top of the cloak. Her husband took his house shirt and then his white skullcap, putting on each in turn. Yawning, he stretched and sat down on the sofa. He spread out his legs and leaned his head against the wall. After his wife finished arranging his clothes, she sat beside his extended feet and began to remove his shoes and socks. When his right foot was bared, the first defect of this handsome, powerful body was revealed. His little toe had been eaten away by successive scrapings of a razor attacking a chronic corn. Amina left the room for a few minutes and returned with a basin and pitcher. Placing the basin by her husband's feet, she stood ready and waiting with the pitcher in her hand. Her husband straightened up and held his hands out to her. She poured the water for him. He washed his face, rubbed his head, and rinsed thoroughly. Then he took the towel from the sofa cushion and set about drying his head, face, and hands, while his wife carried the basin to the bath. This task was the last of many duties she performed in the big house. For a quarter of a century, she had continued to discharge it with an ardor undimmed by ennui. To the contrary, she did it with pleasure and delight, and with the same enthusiasm that spurred her on to undertake the other household chores from just before sunrise until sunset. For this reason she was called the Bee by women in her neighborhood, in recognition of her incessant perseverance and energy. She returned to the room, closed the door, and pulled a pallet out from under the bed. She placed it in front of the sofa and sat cross-legged on it. In good conscience, she did not think she had any right to sit beside him. Time passed without her speaking. She waited until he invited her to speak. Then she would. Her husband slumped back against the sofa cushion. After a long evening of partying, he looked tired. His eyelids, which were red at the edges from his drinking, drooped. He was breathing heavily, as if inebriated. Although he was in the habit of drinking to the point of intoxication every night, he postponed his return home until the effects of the wine had worn off, and he had regained control of himself. He wished to protect his dignity and image at home. His wife was the only member of his family allowed to see him after he had been out carousing. The only effect of the drinking she could remark was the smell. She had never encountered any alarming or perverse conduct from him, except when they were first married, and she had chosen to overlook that. Paradoxically, by keeping him company at this hour, she reaped a chattiness and expansiveness in his conversation she could rarely gain when he was completely sober. She well remembered how distressed she had been when she first noticed he was coming home drunk from his evening escapades. To her mind, wine had always suggested brutality and craziness and, most shocking of all, an offense against religion. She had been disgusted and scared. Whenever he came home, she had suffered unbearable torments. In time, experience had revealed that on his return from his partying, he was more gentle than on any other occasion, and not so stern. His look was more tender, and he was much more talkative. She grew to enjoy his company, and stopped worrying, although she never forgot to implore God to pardon his sin and forgive him. She dearly wished he would be that good-humored when he was sober and in his right mind. She was thoroughly amazed that this sin made him more amiable. She was torn for a long time between her hatred for it, based on her religious training, and the comfort and peace she gained from it. She buried her thoughts deep inside her, however, and concealed them, as though unable even to admit them to herself. Her husband spared no effort to safeguard his dignity and authority. His moments of tenderness were fleeting and accidental. As he sat there, a broad smile might appear on his lips at a memory that cropped up from his happy evening. At once he would get control of himself and press his lips together while stealing a glance at his wife. He would find her as usual, in front of him, with her eyes lowered. Reassured, he would return to his memories and his heart that cherished them as though from an unquenchable thirst for the pleasures of life. It seemed he could still see the party, composed of a select group of his favorite friends and chums. In the midst of them was one of those moon-like beauties who shone in his life from time to time. He could still hear the jokes, wisecracks, and witty comments for which he had such a talent, stringing one after the other when he was animated by wine and music. He recalled his clever remarks with a care and attention accented by wonder and self-satisfaction. He remembered their effect on people, and the success and delight they occasioned, making him everyone's best friend. It was hardly surprising. He often felt the role he played at these parties was so significant that it was practically the ultimate anyone could hope for in life. His career as a whole was a necessary task he performed in order to gain some hours filled with drink, laughter, song, and flirtation, to be spent in the chummy company of his pals. Now and then some of the sweet, catchy tunes that were sung at their happy parties ran through his head. He abandoned himself to them and sighed, as they drifted away from him, "God is most great." He loved the singing as much as the drink, laughter, companions, and pretty girls. He would not tolerate a party without song. It was nothing for him to journey a long way to the outskirts of Cairo in order to hear a renowned male vocalist like El Hamuli, Muhammad Uthman, or El Menyilawi, wherever he resided. Thus their tunes found shelter in his hospitable soul, like nightingales in a leafy tree. He became a music expert, and an acknowledged authority on lyrics, tunes, and music appreciation. He loved song with both his soul and his body. Spiritually, he was transported and overwhelmed. Physically, his senses were strongly aroused, setting him dancing, particularly his head and hands. For this reason, he had unforgettable spiritual and physical associations with lines from songs like, "So why do you torment me and shun me?" or, "What will we know tomorrow? What will we see the following day?" and, "Listen then, and pay attention to what I'm telling you." Any one of these tunes, with its associated family of memories, would suffice to bring his intoxication to a boil. Transported by the music, he would nod his head, smile lasciviously, snap his fingers, and sing along when alone. Singing, however, was not an isolated pleasure attracting him for itself. It was a flower in a bouquet, gaining beauty from the setting, and contributing to it. How welcome it was in the company of a close friend and loyal comrade, when combined with vintage wine and pleasant conversation. To devote himself to it alone, to listen to it at home played on a phonograph, however fine and agreeable that might be, lacked the appropriate atmosphere, ambiance, and environment. How preposterous to think his heart should be satisfied with that. What he liked was to interpose a witty remark between one tune and the next, to set everyone laughing, to take a sip from a full glass before starting the music again, and to observe its effects in the face of a friend or in the eye of a chum. Then they would all join in expressing their admiration by saying, "Praise the Lord." The creation of memories was not the only result of his partying. Another of its virtues was the tendency it produced in him to be kind to his obedient, submissive wife. It was what she longed for when she was with him. He was companionable and talkative. He would tell her his innermost thoughts, thus making her feel, if only for the moment, that she was not just his servant, but also a partner in his life. He proceeded to discuss household matters with her. He told her he had directed a merchant he knew to buy up a reserve of clarified butter, wheat, and cheese for the house. He attacked the rise in prices and the scarcity of necessary commodities caused by this war, which had been giving the world a pounding for the past 3 years. As always, when he mentioned the war, he began cursing the Australian troops who had spread through the city like locusts, destroying the land. The truth was that he had a special reason for resenting the Australians. Their tyranny separated him from the Uzbekia Garden Entertainment District.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?